What if I told you that dark entities don't need to manifest in your living room to destroy you? They invade your dreams first, testing your defenses while you sleep. Ethan Reynolds learned this the hard way during 5 nights that nearly cost him his sanity. But on the 5th night, he discovered Spiritual Power Law 12, a defense tactic so ancient that entities literally recoil when you deploy it correctly. What happened in those dreams wasn't random. It was calculated warfare. And by the end of this video, you'll understand the invasion pattern that most humans never recognize until it's too late. If you're exploring lucid dreaming or astral projection, the most powerful dream defense tactic in history has been hidden from you for centuries. What I'm about to reveal will make you immune to nocturnal spiritual predation. Most people think nightmares are just subconscious noise, random neural firings, stress manifestations. Ethan Reynolds believed that too, right up until the first night. It started on a Tuesday. Nothing special about the day. Ethan had pushed through another 14-hour coding sprint, crashed into bed around 2 a.m., and fell asleep within minutes. The dream began normally enough. He was walking through his childhood home in suburban Ohio. But something was wrong with the light. It wasn't coming from any visible source. It was emanating from the walls themselves, a sickly phosphorescent glow that made his skin crawl. Then he saw it in the hallway mirror. Not his reflection, something wearing his face, but the eyes were completely wrong. Too aware, too focused, looking at him like a predator studying prey through glass. When Dream Ethan moved, the reflection didn't mirror him. It tilted its head independently, smiled with too many teeth and whispered, "We've been waiting for you to sleep." Ethan woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. 3:47 a.m. He told himself it was just stress, too much caffeine, the usual suspects. But his hands were shaking, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been genuinely present in that dream. Not imagined. Present. What Ethan didn't understand yet was that he'd just experienced the first phase of dream invasion, the reconnaissance probe. Dark entities don't just barge into your dreamscape and start psychological warfare. They test first. They watch how you react to wrongness, to fear, to the presence of something other. They're mapping your psychological terrain, identifying weak points in your mental defenses. The entity that appeared in Ethan's mirror wasn't trying to terrify him into waking up. That would have been counterproductive. It wanted him to stay asleep, to remain in the dream just long enough to measure his fear response, his awareness level, his ability to recognize manipulation. Think of it like a burglar checking if your security system is real or just a dummy camera. Ethan went back to sleep around 5 a.m. The entity had what it needed. The next 4 nights would be the real invasion. Here's what most people miss about dream invasion. Entities aren't interested in random scares. They're conducting psychological warfare with surgical precision, and every manifestation serves a strategic purpose. That first dream did 3 critical things that Ethan only understood later. First, it established the entity's presence in his personal memory landscape. By manifesting in his childhood home, it wasn't just creating random nightmare fuel. It was planting a flag in his most emotionally charged mental territory. Your childhood home in dreams represents core identity, foundational memories, the psychological bedrock of who you are. When an entity appears there first, it's sending a message: I can reach your origins. Second, the mirror trick was tactical genius. Mirrors in dreams are portals between conscious and subconscious realms. When the entity hijacked his reflection, it was demonstrating its ability to manipulate the boundary between self and other. That smile with too many teeth wasn't just horror movie aesthetics. It was a power demonstration. It was showing Ethan that it could wear his identity like a mask, that the line between him and it could be blurred. Third, and this is crucial, it spoke to him. We've been waiting for you to sleep. That single sentence accomplished multiple strategic objectives. The plural we suggested he was dealing with multiple entities or a coordinated force. The word waiting implied patience, planning, and that this wasn't random. He was specifically targeted. And for you to sleep revealed their access point. His dreams were now compromised territory. But here's the deepest layer that Ethan didn't grasp yet. The entity's real victory wasn't the fear it generated. It was the fact that Ethan dismissed the experience as just stress when he woke up. That rationalization was exactly what the entity wanted, because if Ethan didn't take the first probe seriously, he wouldn't fortify his defenses before the real attacks began. The entity had successfully deployed what spiritual warfare strategists call the normalization gambit. Make the first intrusion disturbing but not so overwhelming that the target seeks immediate spiritual protection. Keep them in that gray zone where they're unsettled but still in denial. That way, when the second night comes, their defenses are still down, their awareness still fragmented. Ethan's personality made him especially vulnerable to this tactic. As a software architect, he lived in a world of logic, code, and rational problem-solving. His worldview had no framework for acknowledging spiritual predation. That cognitive gap was precisely what the entity would exploit over the next 4 nights. It wasn't fighting Ethan's strength. It was targeting his blind spots. By dawn on Wednesday, Ethan had rationalized the entire experience. The entity's first law of engagement had worked perfectly, and that night, it would return with deeper invasions. This brings us to Spiritual Power Law 1. First contact is always reconnaissance. They map before they attack. Think of dream invasion like this. Imagine a master chess player who doesn't make their real move on turn 1. Instead, they make a small pawn advance that looks insignificant, just testing to see how you respond, what defensive formation you prefer, whether you're aggressive or cautious. That first nightmare isn't the attack. It's the entity studying your playing style before the real game begins. This law explains why so many people report that their worst spiritual experiences came after. Ignoring initial weird dreams, the first manifestation is never the main event. It's the entity's intelligence gathering operation. They need to know, do you recognize spiritual intrusion when it happens? Do you have protective practices in place? Are you the type who fights back or freezes? Do you rationalize supernatural events or acknowledge them? Once you understand Law 1, you realize that the most dangerous moment isn't when entities appear in your dreams. It's when you wake up and decide it meant nothing. Because that decision to dismiss signs of reconnaissance is exactly what allows them to proceed to phase 2, escalation. If Ethan had taken that first dream seriously, if he'd implemented even basic dream protection rituals on Wednesday, the next 4 nights would have played out very differently, but he didn't. And by Thursday night, the entity wasn't just probing anymore, it was building a psychological fortress inside his dreamscape. The real invasion was about to begin. If this is haunting your mind, stop now and hit that subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will shield you against spiritual predators. And if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide these defense tactics from you. Wednesday night came too fast. Ethan had spent the day in meetings, pushing the previous nightmare to the back of his mind. Stress dream, nothing more. But when he closed his eyes at 1:30 a.m., he knew instantly something was different. He didn't gradually fall asleep. He was pulled into the dream, like being yanked underwater by an invisible current. This time, he wasn't in his childhood home. He was in his current apartment, but it was wrong in ways that made his skin crawl. The furniture was in the correct positions, but everything was slightly decayed. His couch had water stains that spread like bruises. His walls had hairline cracks that pulsed with that same sickly phosphorescent light. And the worst part, there were wet footprints leading from his front door to his bedroom, even though he lived on the 14th floor. Ethan followed the footprints, not because he wanted to, but because in the dream logic, he had no choice. His body moved on autopilot, like a character in someone else's game. The bedroom door was ajar, and beyond it he heard breathing. Slow, deliberate. Not his breathing. He pushed the door open. The entity from the mirror was sitting on his bed, still wearing his face but with those predator eyes. It had been waiting. "You came back," it said, and its voice had an echo underneath, like multiple voices speaking in near-perfect unison. "We knew you would. You always do." Then the entity stood up and walked toward him, and Ethan realized with mounting horror that it wasn't just mimicking his appearance anymore. It was moving like him, using his gestures, his head tilt, his nervous habit of cracking knuckles. It had studied him so thoroughly that it could become him, and the accuracy was more terrifying than any monster could be. "You're not real," Ethan managed to say, his voice shaking. The entity smiled with his own face. "Oh, but I'm more real than you are right now. You're the dream, Ethan. I'm the one who's awake." The entity reached out and placed a hand on Ethan's chest, directly over his heart. The touch was ice cold, and Ethan felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not pain. Worse, a sense of hollowing out, like the entity was scooping out his core identity and replacing it with something else. He woke up screaming at 4:12 a.m., but the cold sensation in his chest remained for hours. The entity had moved from reconnaissance to psychological colonization. It wasn't just visiting his dreams anymore. It was building a presence inside them, establishing territorial control over his subconscious landscape. And Ethan still didn't understand the strategic pattern behind what was happening. The second night revealed a darker truth about dream invasion. Entities don't just want to scare you, they want to replace you. What the entity did by touching Ethan's chest wasn't random horror movie theatrics. It was executing what spiritual warfare analysts call identity grafting, the process of planting its own energetic signature into a human's sense of self. By appearing in Ethan's exact form, using his mannerisms, and then making physical contact in the dream, the entity was creating a psychological bridge between Ethan's identity and its own. Think about what that means strategically. When you wake up from a dream where something that looked exactly like you touched you with malicious intent, a subtle psychological fracture occurs. You start to question yourself in weird ways. Am I really me? Are these thoughts mine? Or that lingering doubt is precisely the opening entities need to deepen their influence. They're not trying to possess you in the Hollywood sense. They're trying to blur the lines between your consciousness and theirs until you can't tell where you end and they begin. The wet footprints leading to the bedroom were another calculated detail. Entities don't need to use doors. They're not physical beings. But by manifesting evidence of physical passage through his apartment, the entity was doing something psychologically devastating. It was suggesting that the boundary between waking reality and dream reality wasn't as solid as Ethan believed. Those footprints said, "I was in your bedroom while you were awake. You just didn't notice." And that line, "I'm the one who's awake," was a cognitive weapon designed to destabilize Ethan's sense of what's real. The entity was inverting the power dynamic, suggesting that Ethan's waking life was the actual illusion, and the dream realm where the entity resided was the true reality. This is advanced psychological warfare. If you can make someone doubt the validity of their waking consciousness, you can insert almost any belief system into that gap. The cold sensation that persisted after waking was the most concerning sign. In spiritual warfare, physical sensations that cross the boundary from dream to waking state indicate that an entity has achieved significant energetic access. It means they're no longer confined to your subconscious. They're starting to affect your physical nervous system. The entity had escalated from psychological reconnaissance to energetic infiltration. But here's what Ethan couldn't see because he was in survival mode. The entity was following a specific invasion timeline. Night 1 was reconnaissance. Night 2 was identity grafting. This pattern meant that nights 3, 4, and 5 would follow predictable escalation phases. If Ethan had understood the strategic sequence, he could have broken the pattern before the entity reached its final objective. Instead, he remained in reactive mode, which is exactly where the entity wanted him. A target who only reacts never learns to counterattack. This reveals spiritual power law 2. Identity erosion precedes total invasion. They blur you before they enter you. Here's a more visceral analogy. Imagine a parasitic wasp that doesn't just sting its prey. First, it injects chemicals that rewrite the host's neural pathways, making the host believe the wasp's larvae are its own offspring. The host protects the parasites, feeds them, dies for them, all while believing it's acting according to its own will. Dream invasion entities do the same thing. They inject confusion about your identity so that when they occupy more of your mental space, you defend them as if they're part of you. This is why so many people who experience prolonged spiritual oppression start saying things like, "Maybe this is just who I am now," or "These dark thoughts feel like they've always been mine." That's not enlightenment. That's successful identity erosion. The entity has grafted itself so thoroughly into your sense of self that you can't distinguish your authentic consciousness from the invasive presence. Law 2 explains why spiritual protection isn't just about blocking entities at the door. It's about maintaining absolute clarity about who you are versus who they are. The moment that boundary blurs, you've already lost half the battle. Ethan was experiencing this erosion in real time, and by Thursday night, his sense of self was compromised enough that the entity could proceed to its most ambitious phase, total dream colonization and the extraction of what it had really been after all along. Because entities don't invade dreams just for fun or to feed on fear. They're after something specific, something that only reveals itself when they've broken down enough of your defenses to access it. And on night 3, Ethan would discover what they had been hunting inside him from the very beginning. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Leave your like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the tactics I'll reveal in upcoming videos. By Friday night, the third night, Ethan was barely functional. He'd called in sick to work, not because he was physically ill, but because he couldn't trust his own thoughts anymore. He'd spent the day researching spiritual protection, dream shields, anything that might help. But most advice felt generic, untested, like reading combat manuals written by people who'd never been in actual battle. When exhaustion finally pulled him under around midnight, he knew this would be different. He was right. This time he didn't arrive in any version of his home. He was in a space that shouldn't exist. A vast cathedral made entirely of mirrors, each one reflecting not his current self, but different versions of him. Some were younger, some were older. Some were clearly not him at all, despite wearing his face. And in the center of this impossible architecture stood the entity. But it had dropped the pretense of mimicking him. It was massive now, easily 10 feet tall, composed of that same sickly light, but concentrated into a vaguely humanoid form. Dozens of eyes opened and closed across its surface, and its voice had no echo anymore because the echo was the primary voice. That chorus of near-unified tones that made Ethan's teeth ache. "Do you understand yet?" it asked, and the question reverberated through every mirror. "Understand what?" Ethan's dream voice was barely a whisper. The entity gestured to the mirrors. "You're a builder, Ethan, a creator, an architect of systems. That's not a job title. That's what your consciousness is. You build structures in your mind that most humans can't conceive. We've watched you for years, waiting until you were skilled enough, developed enough, and now you're ready." One of the mirrors shattered, and through the broken glass, Ethan saw something that made his blood turn cold. It was a blueprint, but not for any building or software system. It was a blueprint of consciousness itself, showing how thought structures could be weaponized, how mental architectures could be hijacked to serve as gateways between dimensions. And at the center of this blueprint was his own signature, his unique way of building systems, being reverse-engineered by something non-human. "You're going to help us," the entity said, moving closer. "You're going to build a bridge. Not consciously. You'll do it in your dreams, piece by piece, thinking they're just vivid nightmares. But really, you'll be constructing the access point we've needed. A mind like yours, properly prepared, can open doors that have been sealed for millennia." The entity reached toward Ethan's forehead, and he understood with absolute clarity that if that touch landed, it was over. Not death, worse, permanent colonization. His mind would become the construction site for something vast and hungry, and he'd be aware the entire time, trapped inside his own skull, while his gifts were perverted into a cosmic doorway. That's when something inside Ethan broke, or maybe awakened. He remembered his grandmother, long dead, who used to whisper old prayers before bed. He remembered his own childhood sense of sovereignty over his inner world, before logic and adulthood taught him to dismiss such things. And in that cathedral of mirrors, facing a predator that had stalked him through dreams, Ethan Reynolds made a choice. He would not be colonized. What happened next is what spiritual warfare strategists call the sovereign refusal, the moment when a human consciousness recognizes its fundamental authority over its own inner territory and exercises that authority with absolute conviction. Ethan didn't know any fancy protection rituals. He hadn't studied spiritual warfare tactics or read ancient grimoires. But in that moment, something primal and ancient activated inside him. He looked directly at the entity and said, not with fear but with cold certainty, "This is my dream. You're in my house, and I'm invoking Law 12. He didn't even know what Law 12 was. The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious knowledge, pulled from some collective spiritual memory bank that humans carry but rarely access. And the effect was instantaneous and devastating. The entity recoiled like it had been hit with physical force. All those eyes widened simultaneously, and for the first time, Ethan saw something in them that wasn't predatory confidence. It was fear. "You don't know what you're invoking," it hissed, but its voice was fragmenting, losing cohesion. Law 12 requires sacrifice. It requires me to remember that no entity, no matter how powerful, has more authority in my inner world than I do, Ethan said, and the words felt like igniting a nuclear reactor inside his chest. "This is sovereign territory. You were never invited. You exploited gaps in my awareness, but those gaps are closing right now." The mirrors began shattering one by one, each breaking with a sound like thunder. The entity was shrinking, its massive form collapsing inward as the cathedral dissolved. "This isn't over," it managed to say before the entire dreamscape collapsed into white light. "You'll forget. Humans always forget. And when you do, we'll..." But Ethan never heard the end of that threat, because he initiated something that most people never successfully execute in dreams. A conscious, intentional exit. He woke himself up by sheer force of will, not in panic but in controlled extraction, pulling his consciousness out of the dream realm like a soldier extracting from hostile territory. 4:44 a.m., he was awake. The cold sensation in his chest was gone, replaced by a strange heat, like something inside him had been cauterized. The entity's presence, that invasive feeling that had haunted him for 3 nights, was absent. Genuinely absent. The silence in his head was deafening. Over the next 2 nights, nights 4 and 5, Ethan waited for the entity to return. It didn't. He had dreams, but they were normal, chaotic, unmolested by external presence. The entity had withdrawn, and Ethan understood why. It had invested 3 nights of increasingly expensive energy expenditure into colonizing him, only to hit a defense it couldn't breach. Spiritual predators are pragmatic. They move on to easier targets rather than waste resources on someone who's activated their sovereignty. But the real revelation came later, when Ethan researched what he'd unknowingly invoked. Law 12 wasn't some new age invention or modern spiritual concept. It appeared in dozens of ancient traditions under different names, but the core principle was identical. No entity can maintain occupation of a human consciousness that has fully awakened to its own sovereignty and explicitly withdraws consent from the invasion. The entity had been right about one thing. Ethan was a builder, an architect of systems. And in that cathedral of mirrors, he'd done something more powerful than constructing weapons. He'd reinforced the fundamental architecture of his own identity, making it impenetrable to external colonization. The blueprint. This brings us to Spiritual Power Law 12, the most important of all. Sovereignty invoked with full conviction cannot be overridden. Your conscious consent is the only bridge they need. The devastating analogy. Imagine a fortress that can only be entered if the owner opens the door and says, "Come in." No matter how sophisticated the siege equipment, no matter how powerful the army, that door stays closed without the owner's consent. Dream invasion entities are exactly like this. They need your unconscious cooperation, your passive acceptance of their presence, your failure to claim sovereignty. The moment you wake up to your fundamental authority and revoke consent with full conviction, not hope, not fear, but absolute knowing, they have no mechanism to maintain occupation. This is why Law 12 is simultaneously the most powerful and the most difficult defense. It doesn't require complicated rituals or extensive spiritual knowledge. It requires something much harder, unshakable certainty about your own sovereignty. Most humans don't possess that certainty because we've been conditioned to see ourselves as vulnerable, as prey, as victims of forces beyond our control. Entities exploit that learned helplessness mercilessly. But when someone like Ethan accesses that deep knowing, that primal recognition of this is my territory and you have no authority here, entities can't maintain their grip. It's not about being stronger than them. It's about recognizing that in the realm of consciousness, they're intruders by definition. And intruders require the homeowner's unconscious permission to remain. Here's what haunts Ethan to this day. He still doesn't know if those 5 nights were literally real or metaphorically real. Did an actual entity invade his dreams, or did his subconscious create a scenario to teach him about sovereignty? And the terrifying answer is, it doesn't matter. Because whether the entity was external or an externalized representation of his own shadow material, the lesson was identical. Consciousness that claims its own authority becomes impenetrable. The entity never returned, but sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, Ethan feels a presence testing the edges of his awareness, and every single time he invokes Law 12. This is sovereign territory. You're not invited, leave. And every single time the presence withdraws, because now he knows the rules that govern spiritual warfare. Now he understands that the only power entities truly have is the power we unconsciously give them through fear, doubt, and the failure to claim what's fundamentally ours. Absolute authority over our own inner world. 5 nights, 3 invasion phases, 1 law that changed everything. Ethan Reynolds discovered what shamans and mystics have known for millennia. Spiritual predation follows predictable patterns, and those patterns can be broken by anyone who understands the strategic rules of engagement. Law 1 taught him that first contact is always reconnaissance. Law 2 revealed that identity erosion precedes total invasion. But Law 12, the law of sovereign refusal, showed him that consciousness claiming its own authority becomes an impenetrable fortress. The 3 laws connect like this. They map you, they blur you, but they can only colonize you if you unconsciously consent. Break any link in that chain, and the invasion collapses. Now you know the rules of spiritual warfare that most humans never learn. But the question is, will you remember them when you need them most? If these spiritual warfare secrets blew your mind, you need to see my next videos. But only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful tactics in history. What was your strangest supernatural experience? Leave it in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. These stories are inspired by documented spiritual experiences and strategic analysis. Individual experiences may vary. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes, not spiritual counseling.